Hi, my name is Goda Trakumaite. I am an artist. Currently, I live in Philadelphia, and over the past 10 years, since I obtained an undergraduate degree in philosophy, I have worked as an arts administrator, an educator, a theater usher, an illustrator, a farmer, a landscaper, and a Christmas tree salesperson. Kind of a determining collaboration that began back in 2011 and continues to this day is the illustration work that I do for a seed company in Southern California called the Plant Good Seed Company. I draw plants for their seed packets. Quinn, who runs this company, sent me the seeds that became my first garden and really clued me into the fact that for me, work with plants feels more compelling and enriching than just about any other activity I have ever tried. Although my first garden was probably the one where I picked worms off of cabbages in my grandma's yard in Lithuania as a 7-year-old, this is the community garden where I tended to my first plot as an adult on the west side of Buffalo, New York. And this is the garden near my house in Philly where I've grown food and medicine for the past couple seasons, and which is an entire city block that used to be a refrigerator factory. I would describe my life so far as being a steady project of deprofessionalization in favor of accumulating a broad range of knowledge and experience, especially around the subject of plants. But because distinctions and categories are only human-invented impositions to the actual order of the world, sometimes plants includes things like worms. I like this wording for what I've been trying to gather and do. And I can specify that my particular process of accumulation includes, but is probably not limited to, working jobs at nurseries and open farms, taking classes about things like herbalism and ecological landscape design with people who know more about these things than I do, reading books and things on the internet, tending different garden plots over a series of seasons, growing plants in containers and other small spaces, learning to notice plants that exist everywhere around me, volunteering with different projects that I think do interesting work, and talking to other people who care about plants. All of this is driven by genuine curiosity, deep enjoyment, and a general eye towards possibilities for survival. And this presentation is for sharing some of the things that I've noticed about different ways that humans can relate to plants in an extension to the rest of the world of which we are a part. Some of these stories make me feel frustrated and angry, and others offer maybe not quite hope, but hopefully a little respite from despair. Our first exhibit is maybe kind of a well-understood and basic cliche at this point, but it's significant enough to mention briefly. Industrial agriculture, which was developed and championed and exported throughout the world by economically dominant global powers like the US in the mid-20th century under the auspices of addressing hunger and producing reliably large quantities of food to feed everyone, is now threatening the world's food supply. The habitat destruction and poisonous chemical application required by this mode of farming has led to a world wherein 41% of insect species are in decline and 1/3 of all insect species are threatened. Most of the food crops we depend on to survive require insect pollination in order to actually produce the food parts of the plant. There is an industry of beekeepers who travel with their hives to almond orchards in California in order to help pollinate this valuable crop. This is a picture of them unloading beehives onto an orchard. And as the title of the Guardian article profiling one of these commercial beekeepers says, it's like sending bees to war. The pesticides the bees are exposed to leave them vulnerable to pests and disease, and colonies don't always survive into the next season. And of course, bees are not the only agricultural workers whose health and livelihood is dramatically harmed by toxic farming practices. Humans that work in sprayed fields also face exposure and can lead to respiratory illnesses, cancers, birth defects, and neurological diseases. Stuff is extremely poisonous. And the way that we grow food on a mass scale is in a dysfunctional relationship with this food itself and with the creatures who actually enable the existence of this food. And there are other possibilities. On the left is a photo of a conventional almond orchard where the soil underneath the trees is kept clear of plants with herbicide and machinery. And on the right is a picture of a polyculture orchard. Polyculture meaning multiple different types of plants are cultivated here, where underneath a fruit tree there is a planting of flowering plants that attract and feed pollinators. They might also have medicinal or aesthetic value for humans. It is probably not possible to have the one on the right be as efficient or productive in commercial terms as the one on the left, but it is also not possible to have the one on the left without decimating insect populations and actually also the already extremely strained water supply in California where most of our almonds are grown. So to get closer to some kind of a less irrational relationship with food, it might also be essential for humans to assess our food needs and desires and move away from having things that are impossible to grow in mass sustainably be a staple part of our diets. Exhibit B is these drought-tolerant native plantings that you have to be cautious around that my friend Quinn took a photo of in Southern California. In North America, native plants is a phrase that is used to refer to plants that existed in any particular region prior to European colonization. Some of these plants are still doing just fine, but others have become rare or even endangered because of the different ways in which humans have interacted with the land on this continent over the past 500 or more years. M. Cat Anderson's book, Tending the Wild, carefully chronicles this process as it took place in what is today the state of California. It cites firsthand accounts of the miraculously rich and diverse landscapes that the early settlers and missionaries described upon first entering the region. They assumed this landscape was wild and didn't understand that it was actually meticulously cared for by the indigenous people who had been living in that area for at least 12,000 years before the start of European settlement. The settlers immediately embarked on a rampage of destruction aimed at the human, animal, and plant communities that called this place home. These two photographs from the book illustrate two different logics of relating to salmon and an extension of the rest of the other than human world. One is rooted in reciprocal survival. The other in devastating exploitation for the sake of material gains beyond what is actually needed for survival. So native plants are plants that prior to European settlement and colonization were abundant, and this abundance was rooted in the fact that indigenous people used them in their day-to-day lives for food, medicine, shelter, beauty, function, ceremony. And therefore, recognizing their essential role in people's survival, they cared for them in ways that kept the plant communities rich and thriving. The fact that these plants are not abundant now has everything to do with the history of indigenous genocide, land theft, and violent cultural suppression at the foundation of this country. In recent decades, however, native plants have become a profitable trend in the landscaping industry, and all too often, the history gets entirely lost as plants become commodified and rarefied and conceptualized as a hobby for retired, frequently white ladies with large suburban properties. As a landscaper, I have seen many people think about and treat their plants in their yards like furniture, telling me to pull an established, thriving vine that wouldn't survive a relocation intact because they wanted a yellow instead of a red bloom. Okay, back to our cautious native planting in California. Outside of a new condo development in Los Angeles County, which in 2020 recorded over 60,000 people experiencing houselessness, a 12% increase from the previous year. In the center right of this image, shot in the same area, across the street from what I assume might be another construction site for new luxury condos, in the shade of a building, you can see a line of tents that people have set up to live in. The stark wealth inequality highlighted by these contrasting housing possibilities, along with a caution tape, drives home the reality that there is actually nothing life-sustaining about the way the native plantings are deployed here. They're a status symbol, beautifying and not affordable, resource-intensive, and likely shoddy development project, and they are definitely not meant to provide food, medicine, shelter, or even shade to any of the residents of the area. Sam Block published an interesting article on this last resource, Shade, in Places Journal in 2019. And this is a photo that accompanies this article in which he traces the history of shade access and urban planning and urban forestry in Los Angeles to drive home the point that shade access is the privilege afforded mostly to wealthier areas of the city. In the article, he talks about how in the early to mid-20th century, the palm trees we see in both of these last two images, which are not native to California, by the way, became the most common street tree in Los Angeles, not because they served a practical function like heat mitigation, but more as a marketing campaign for the sunshine and tropicalness of California, and because of their undemanding nature. They have small, unobstructed roots and can pretty much grow anywhere. In this other photo published with the article, you can see that large shade trees, on the other hand, refuse to mind the city's infrastructure. There's lots of nuance in there, focusing on things like crime, surveillance, and people's experiences with trees as potentially providing cover for shady, as in criminalized activity. And while nothing is more important than the considerations of community residents themselves in creating functional and just urban designs, considering that heat waves hospitalize more than 15,000 people in LA County a year, and that unmitigated climate change is only ticking up the numbers of excessive heat days, shade trees offer some semblance of a solution to all aspects of the problem by both cooling the city as a whole and providing respite for individuals to bring their bodies back towards an equilibrium that is seriously strained by the heat. Unlike the sterility and containment of that native planting outside the new condos, there's a poetry to these big trees that are literally swallowing and breaking up city infrastructure, proposing solutions it seems like urban planners are not yet ready to hear. And here's a different, no maintenance, no input, no caution required native planting, this one in Philadelphia. And this is goldenrod, a bright fall bloomer that provides beneficial food source for pollinators late in the season and has a human use history for fevers, colds, and urinary tract issues. I probably wouldn't harvest this particular one for personal use, imagining that it is doing a different job here for providing a little color and softness in a densely gray concrete landscape and sucking up exhaust on the side of a wide and trafficked road. Another example of urban design by plants, dandelions coming up through the gravel at my Philadelphia community garden and former home of a refrigerator factory. The types of plants that come up on their own in different areas give us clues about what's going on with the soil there. Dandelions specifically have deep running taproots which allow them to grow in compacted nutrient-stripped soils because these long roots are able to reach deep to get the nutrients they need. And by growing in them, the dandelion roots actually do some soil remediation work by loosening up the compaction and eventually creating possibilities for other plants to grow in the area. Here's another example of a similar strategy, this time implemented by people. Last fall, Indigenous activists and Six Nation members in what is today known as Ontario, Canada, commandeered equipment from construction sites to set up physical barriers preventing the construction of 918 new homes into developments planned to happen on contested territory. 95% of the land granted to the Six Nations in the late 18th century has either flooded, been privatized, become incorporated into other municipalities, or been ceded to settlers through legally questionable and suspect land surrenders. So these housing developments were threatening some of the last remaining land that Six Nation members believe rightly belonged to them. According to social media updates posted mid-March by activists on the ground of what has become known as 1492 Landback Lane, they have now been stationed at the site for 4 seasons, over 230 days, and are continuing to prevent the construction that would mean permanent loss of the territory. This is not about plants exactly, but it is an example of human adaptations of strategies we see plants deploying against impermeable infrastructure meant to facilitate often inhumane development and progress. Okay, and I'm not sure what number we are on in these meandering examples, but another human-plant relationship I don't like is the destruction of sacred plant populations for decontextualized, frequently culturally appropriative rituals and trendy healing. White sage smudges is a popular one. This plant grows in a relatively small region of Southern California and northern Mexico, and most of what is sold today is wildcrafted, meaning it's taken from wild plant populations. The high global demand for this particular plant to burn has decimated these populations and has made it difficult for indigenous people of the region to harvest it for their own ceremonial use. The same logic of chaos and destruction extends to medicinal herbs. Wild populations of plants like golden seal become decimated as the herb, for some conflation of different reasons, becomes a hot one in the global marketplace. And then personal healing comes at a high cost, not just because supplements tend to be expensive. This is the case because on a large scale, we're out of touch with the plants we want to use. A good way to avoid literally buying into this is doing some research before purchasing a plant-based product and favoring companies that grow the herbs used in their preparations, rather than wildcrafting them. Which in my opinion is a deceptive word for a potentially nefarious and often exploitative process. And there are also plenty of plants that have medicinal qualities that are either weedy, meaning they grow easily and plentifully on their own, or aren't really regionally specific, meaning they can grow in many different places, and therefore are less at risk of becoming endangered. United Plant Savers is one organization that is doing work to counteract the trends that are threatening to wipe out certain medicinal plant populations by doing education and setting up sanctuaries to tend to some of these plants. On their website, they have a list of medicinal plants they consider to be in danger, and that's a good one to consult before buying a tincture or a salve from the supermarket. Something that I've noticed in reading ethnobotany texts and studying different healing traditions is that people pretty much used every plant that grew around them. The things that were most abundant and available were also the things that were the most used. This is true not just for people as indigenous to North America, which I've studied because it's where I live, but for the European cultures I've tried to learn about, especially focusing on Lithuania and Poland, the geographical area where I'm from. And probably this is true for pretty much any pre-industrial culture that developed in locations with plant life. People use what's there. It's interesting to read about correlate plants on different continents being used for similar purposes. And while the trade in spices and herbs is also quite old, I think the contemporary valorization and then overuse of particular plants has a lot to do with our general disconnectedness from place and the lack of knowledge about what actually makes sense, how or where things grow, and how it's probably possible to get everything we need, even if it's not everything we think we want, within our own bioregion. And this is a picture of a nettle from one of my garden beds, a food, medicine, and fiber plant that I can buy dried online from Hungary, or that I can grow without literally doing anything after planting it because it is a weed and takes care of itself and comes back year after year. The main task is actually to keep it from growing too much and taking over too large an area of the garden. Instead of white sage, when I want to burn a plant for a nice smell and feeling, I burn rosemary or lavender stems. I think the adaptation of using what is readily available to me makes a lot of sense, but I know it's not the only approach to addressing the problem of chaos demand. Another solution is growers who are cultivating plants we think of as wild so that we can continue to share the planet with them in new and hopefully more sustainable ways. This is a picture of a white sage plant and some white sage seeds that my friend Quinn took. He is the person that runs the seed company, and he works in this way with this plant, white sage. He saved seeds of this plant for 5 years, and in that time, the germination rate for the seeds he harvests each season has gone from 30 to 76%. What this means is that if you were to gather some seeds from a wild sage plant and try to start them at home in a little container the way you might with a tomato or something, only 2 or 3 out of every 10 seeds you planted would actually sprout. This percentage, 20 to 30%, is called the germination rate. And just for context, most vegetables we grow have a germination rate of 80% and up. Like if you are selling seeds on the market, you need to get them tested to make sure that they're above a certain percentage. White sage has such low levels of germination in the home garden context, possibly because it evolved alongside cycles of fire in its home region and has adapted to that by actually requiring some fire, some smoke, in order to propagate itself most effectively. But if, like Quinn, every year that you grow the white sage in your garden, you harvest the seeds of your most vigorous, quick-to-sprout plants, you are selecting for the trait of easier germination. And what this enables over time is the possibility of this highly desirable plant to be more easily grown by people for themselves or even in a commercial context, thus hopefully taking some pressure off of the wild stands and leaving them to the low-impact gatherers, the indigenous people of present-day California, who have been building a relationship with that plant for thousands of years. There are countless more examples in all directions of ways in which humans have adapted and maladapted to living alongside plants, which are undoubtedly essential to our survival. And while I do believe that we can contribute to their survival as well, I find it a little hopeful or helpful to notice that on the longer time scale, we might be less essential to their certain survival than they are to ours. Thank you.